birthed the idea for the book. When we move to the next slide, George and Scott may be familiar with a name that I have often invoked, the name of for me, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, a guy called Bertrand Russell. Russell was not only a philosopher, I knew him from high school as a mathematician. And I've become wedded to something that Bertrand Russell said way back in the 1950s, if we can move back to that slide. And what Bertrand Russell said way back in the 50s, can we go back to the previous slide? You know, he said, you know, sometimes it's good to hang a question mark on things you take for granted or things you don't know about. And I thought that it might be useful for me to hang 3 question marks in this conversation as a way of enabling people who are listening or viewing to have an appreciation of what the book is all about. And so if we go to the next slide, we'll see that the first question mark has to do with, well, what is this study all about? What are the aims? The book has 6 aims to allow you to read some of them. But the idea is to have some conceptual analysis provided. Any scholarly work needs to have that. But also to probe some of the issues that are relevant to the germane, to sovereignty and to security in the Caribbean. Let's go back to that previous slide. But as was mentioned by Carl in his remarks, I thought it'd be useful not only to do some general regional analysis, but to do some case studies. And you'll see that there is a focus in the 4th aim of the study to take a closer look at what happened in Jamaica with the Dodos Coke affair in 2010, and what happened in Trinidad and Tobago in 2011 with their state of emergency. And so the 6 objectives, we can go to the next couple of slides. The 6 objectives are outlined in the first chapter, setting the stage. Next slide, please. Setting the stage for the study that hopefully colleagues will have a chance to read and digest and act on. Seems as though the presentation is having some molasses thrown on it. Slower. So I think it's important to have a sense beyond the objectives, a sense of what the architecture of the book is all about. How is it structured? As part of the first question mark, following Bertrand Russell's advice. And the book is organized into 4 sections, 8 chapters, a little more than 300 pages. And as I often am inclined to do, I think it's important to provide hard evidence. So you'll find a lot of tables, a lot of graphs, a lot of figures. Actually, there are 4 to 6 altogether, including a couple of sidebars. But you'll also find in the book an extradition treaty signed by the United States and Jamaica in 1983. That extradition treaty is significant for a number of reasons. One, it was the basis for the engagement between the United States and Jamaica in relation to the Dodos Coke affair. But when you read, if you have a chance to read the treaty and the letter from President Reagan at the time, sending the treaty to Congress, you will see the explanation of that treaty served as a basis for several other US treaties with other countries around the world. It's a model of what was used in the 1980s, starting with Jamaica. But as I said, and Carl referred to, their case studies, Jamaica and Trinidad, but there's also one on Suriname. So that's a sense of what the architecture of the book is all about. Let's go to the next slide. Any study worth its salt would naturally have a central thesis. And my central thesis is fairly simple. The thesis is captured in that second bullet, that the threats posed by drugs and crime terrorism and cyber threats are exacerbating the vulnerability of Caribbean countries. Not simply exacerbating the vulnerability, but compromising the circumstance leading to what I define as challenge sovereignty in the book. So, challenge sovereignty, next slide please, is a central component of what the book is all about. Let's hang a question mark on the second question. Let's go to the next slide, please. And when we go to the next slide, we begin to hang a question mark on, well, what are some of the main propositions? What are some of the key suggestions, arguments of the book? I've used the notion of problems without passports. Let's go back to that previous slide. Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, late distinguished Secretary General, coined the term back in the year 2000, I think it was, about these problems without passports. And for me, the four challenges to which I refer, drugs, crime, terrorism, cyber threats, are problems without passports. And so in looking at the problems without passports, you see that problems without passports defy political authority, defy territorial boundaries of states. But more than defying authority and boundary, they threaten the safety and security of individuals and groups in those countries, impacting the sovereignty of states. I offer a definition of what challenge sovereignty is. We'll allow you to read it at your own leisure. And for those who are more scientifically inclined, I captured in a formula challenge sovereignty, the notion that I propose in the book. So the key propositions are an important part of what the issue is all about. But when we go to the next slide, we'll find the beginning of what perhaps is the most significant of the three question marks. What are the main findings? Let's go to the next slide. And I think it's important to suggest that in the context of understanding the main findings, I am arguing that the challenges, drugs, crime, etc., those problems without passports, are not merely challenges within the Caribbean. They're challenges of the Caribbean. They are challenges of every society, every state in the region, whether Hispanic, Anglophone, Lusophone, whatever it is. It's only a matter of degree of severity of impact. Now, we'll also find that there are some of the four that resonate with a greater history. The drugs and challenges has had a long history than the cyber threat, for example. But I think it's important to recognize that we're not talking about episodic, spasmodic challenges. We're talking about all Caribbean countries. Let's go to the next slide, please. Affected by these issues. But it is not only, and we go to the next slide, we'll appreciate, it's not only what academics like myself, people like Scott and George who write on the region and others, it's not only what we pontificate, what we suggest are the realities. These challenges are defined as challenges by the political leaders of the region. They define as challenges significant threats to sovereignty and security by countries that have an interest in the region, whether they're United States interests, European Union interests, Canadian interests, other parts of the world have interest in the region. These are challenges considered to be clear and present dangers by countries within the Caribbean and outside of the Caribbean. But the reality is that notwithstanding the nature of the challenges, perhaps because of the nature of the challenges, attention to these issues are not amenable only to action by countries in the Caribbean. As a matter of fact, there's a transnationality, there's a multidimensionality that means Caribbean countries by themselves cannot deal with these issues. And so the collaboration, the support by other countries has been a constant desideratum of the realities of the region. And that, I think, is one of the things that stands out as one of the main findings of the study. Now, it might not surprise you when we go to the next slide. It might not surprise you that the circumstances of the region's security and sovereignty have been impacted by the pandemic. I take the opportunity in the book to show how COVID-19 has enabled the circumstances of the sovereignty and the security of the region to be worsened. The telework and the telemedicine, the distance learning created a space for cybercrime, for other things, created some stresses, aggravating the stresses already there from the drugs and the crime, already there from the issues of terrorism. And you see evidence of the stresses created by the pandemic, the aggravation of the challenge sovereignty, when you also see that Caribbean countries were not able by themselves to deal with the compounding realities of the pandemic. I spent some time talking about what are some of the manifestations of those realities. One of those manifestations has been the fact that all Caribbean countries, except two, had to rely significantly on non-Caribbean-based sources to manage and to cope with the realities of the pandemic. As a matter of fact, there's only one Caribbean country that has been able to produce vaccines to be able to manage part of the trauma of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then the book, next slide, please, takes an opportunity to do a deep dive into the realities of the drugs. And as all scholars or observers of the region would know, if we go to the next slide, very often people who think of the Caribbean in relation to drugs highlight the trafficking. But the trafficking is only one component of the drugs phenomenon of the region. I mean, I did a book way back in 1997, which is still I'm getting royalties from that book, a good thing. And I took the opportunity there, and I take the opportunity in this book to explain that there's a multidimensionality with regard to drugs. It's not only trafficking, it's production of certain legal substances. It's also money laundering is there, consumption and abuse is there. But part of the reality of the drugs in relation to trafficking and consumption is now realities that there are opportunities in the United States where the legalization of marijuana for medicinal and recreational purposes has thrown a new wrinkle into the drama of drugs. Here's a wrinkle. Although 47 states in the United States and the District of Columbia have legalized certain quantities of marijuana for medicinal and recreational purposes, at the federal level, it is still illegal to traffic in it. So the counter-narcotics engagement by the United States federal government is still prosecuted. But here's an additional wrinkle. Beginning in 2022, there began to be some reverse trafficking of marijuana. It used to be that the drugs would come from South America or the Caribbean to the United States. Now the federal authorities are finding that trafficking of marijuana from the United States to the Caribbean is part of this new drama, part of this new reality. But I also spent a good amount of time in doing a deep dive into drugs to see what's happening in the Caribbean with legalization, decriminalization. There's a fascinating section of the book that takes a very deep dive at what has been happening. Next slide, please, on that front. The reforms that many countries, next slide, please, have been not only designing, but beginning to execute is an interesting part of understanding the drama of drugs relation to the Caribbean, and to other parts of the world. Let's move to the next slide. Part of the crime component, part of the crime problem with our passport is the significant challenge regarding homicides. And I provide quantitative as well as qualitative data to show what are some of the dynamics of the crime impacting the sovereignty, impacting the security of countries in the region. And you take a look at the graph that I have there, which is figure 4.1 in chapter 4 of the book. It's no consolation for Colombia to say that Venezuela had more homicides in 2022, 2021. But look, what countries at the top of that bar? Jamaica. The reality, next slide, please, though, is that murders, homicides, are only part of the drama in relation to crime. The region also has a significant amount of other than homicides crime, other than violent crime. Some of it is domestic violence, some of it is robbery, some of it is poverty-driven crime. But a continual challenge that is progressively undermining the security and the sovereignty of many countries is a nexus between the crime and guns. The arms trafficking is a significant challenge in the region. I was asked to join a task force last year looking at arms trafficking in the region. We had our first meeting in Barbados last November. And if you want to get a snapshot of this virulence of this issue, take a look at that study by the Small Arms Survey, examining in a deep dive way the problem of guns. And the problem of guns is an intimate connection, aggravating the circumstances of crime in the region. But it is not only the guns, it is this other G word, gangs, that is complicating the circumstance of crime. And there is part of the portrait on the criminality captured by the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and I have a couple of sentences. Every Jamaican would have recognized that the nature and frequency of the violence have evolved to a level of barbarity and a level of savagery. And you have an appreciation, I provide an appreciation of that barbarity and savagery with some specific examples in Jamaica, in Trinidad and Tobago, in St. Lucia, in Haiti, of the extent to which is not only the volume, it's the atrocity, the barbarity, to use Prime Minister Holness's term, that is part of this clear and present danger of the crime situation. What it means is that many jurisdictions, as a way of coping with the criminality, has had to impose states of emergency. You know, one country in Central America is almost on a virtual permanent state of emergency. But other countries in the Caribbean have had to do similar things. Jamaica, Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago are the notable cases. And I provide an example of not only what the reality of the crime is, but what are some of the coping mechanisms on the policy and operational front to deal with the issue of crime. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide allows us, as we come to the end of the part of the portrait of the study, the next slide allows us to focus on what I consider one of the significant conundrums in dealing with these problems without passports, especially the drugs and crime. And that conundrum has to do with the prison realities. I share a sentence that was attributed to Fyodor Dostoevsky, when he says that the degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. Harsh reality of Caribbean prisons is such that you wonder about civilization and values. You ask the question, who are the people in the Caribbean prisons? a significant portion of the criminality reflected in prisons are people in the productive ages of their lives between 18 and 35. What does it mean for a society where 30 or 40% of its citizens are not gainfully employed in the society's economic and social livelihoods, but are incarcerated? Incarcerated in prisons that are overcrowded. Look at what the statistic says for Haiti, 454% overcrowded. You go down the list, and it's not only the large countries like Haiti and Dominican Republic having those challenges, it's the small ones like Grenada, Antigua Barbuda, St. Lucia. The overcrowding reality is part of the challenge of managing the society as a society that is civilized. But let's go to the next slide. And as we move towards the end of the portrait of the book, I spent some time on the terrorism issue. There was a time when the term terrorism was not part of the lexicon of the Caribbean until 9/11. That is not to say that there had not been terrorist incidents in the Caribbean, but it had not reached the level of a discourse or a clear and present danger until 9/11. But I take the trouble in the book to explain that there were pre-9/11 terrorism incidents. Perhaps the most significant one was what happened in 1976 off Barbados, the destruction of a Cubana plane, killing citizens of several countries, Jamaica, Korea, and so on, Cuba. So there's the conversation of importance about the terrorism realities. And if we go to the next slide, we'll find that part of that conversation about terrorism in the Caribbean, historically and contemporarily, would not escape a deep focus, next slide please, on Trinidad and Tobago. And I leave people who are interested in the book to read about the role of Trinidad and Tobago, not only insofar as regional terrorism is concerned, but also in contributing to a global terrorism. Trinidad has the dubious distinction of being the place in the Caribbean that sent the most significant number of people to fight in the Middle East, ISIS. And not only the numbers, but the number of children who went, the number of women who went. So the terrorism issue is a conversation of importance in the book, as is the business of cybercrime. And when we go to the next slide, we see, and I make the point in the book, that the cybercrime issue is not only a significant one. Next slide, please. It's not only a significant one worldwide and in the Caribbean, it's growing. And you get a sense not only of the skyrocketing nature of the cost of crime, the impact of crime, of cybercrime, but the realities of the circumstance of the region such that Caribbean countries by themselves aren't able to manage this clear and present danger. Cybercrime is part of the conversation, part of the clear and present danger of the region. And so as we come to the end of my part of the conversation, next slide, please. I thought I'll share with you, I'll leave with you one of the two epigraphs from the last chapter of the book. An epigraph from Jose Marti. Let's go to that next slide. And I use Jose Marti, and I allow you to read. I'll just mention the first sentence. Jose Marti said way back, "A vital idea set ablaze before the world at the right moment can, like the mystic banner of the Last Judgment, stop a fleet of battleships." But he also went on to say that it is in the hour of reckoning and of marching in unison that we must move in line as compact as the veins of silver that lie at the roots of the Andes. The Caribbean countries have got to march in unison in managing these problems about passports. And they've got to march in unison with the other state and non-state actors that share the pain of the drugs and the crime. And I thought it might be useful to end with the words of Jose Marti. But let's end with a little bit of video in the next slide, if we can get the next slide to work. And that will bring to the end my contribution to the conversation.
I think there's a little delay, Doctor. I think
Yeah.
with the, here we go.
There we go. You can get the volume to work, it'll be even better. Having some sound challenges, it seems, but that's all right.
You still look
So
great.
that's it.
It's still very impressive.
That's my 15 Caribbean minutes of contribution to the conversation.
Thank you so much. We apologize for that. There was some sort of delay that made it difficult to keep the pace, but but what was important is the content. And we move on to our first commentary, which will be Scott?
Actually, it's going to be George.
George.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Ivelaw, for this opportunity to participate in this sort of panel discussion on your latest book. I say latest, and I emphasize the word latest. It's sort of evident in the PowerPoint we just saw. It sort of underscores that this study, in effect, covers a set of themes that the author has mined very deeply in previous published efforts and thought about seriously over the past 3 decades. In my mind, it begins with the book that he alluded to in his presentation, Drugs and Security in the Caribbean, whose subtitle significantly was Sovereignty Under Siege. So there's a theme that continues throughout a lot of his work, and this book was issued in 1997. In other words, this is an author who comes to his latest publication with a profound knowledge and understanding, appreciation of the complexity of the issues, and more importantly, perhaps by now, has the contacts, the relationships with the institutional actors among the region's law enforcement, military, legal, scholarly communities. And I think this is not to be underestimated because these are complex themes. Fast forward to today, to 2024, and obviously the range of issues, of actors, which the author characterizes as problems without passports, or PWPs, has broadened beyond drug trafficking, which was the major theme of the book in 1997. And that includes this overlapping, messy, brutal at times universe of crime, terrorists, and cyber networks and related national and international threats. So this may be stating the obvious, but the first sort of strength of this new study is therefore it provides a deep conceptual framework of analysis and a solid assessment of the multinational dimensions of criminal networks operating in the Caribbean and by extension, frankly, the rest of the world, and related to drugs, terrorism, and increasingly cyber threats, as noted in the PowerPoint presentation we just saw. Second, among a sort of a widening universe of case studies that review each of these factors in a number of different forums and publications affecting the Caribbean region at large, many of these studies are actually conveniently, by the way, listed in the opening chapter of the book. So there's sort of a point of reference that you immediately see as you go through the study. The study actually integrates a lot of these factors into what ultimately becomes I would argue, a somewhat chilling review of regional sociopolitical and economic dynamics. The sheer damage to basic societal and governmental functions is made obvious as you go through this particular study. and the somewhat uneven, shall we say, engagement of international and multinational actors, notably the United States, and sometimes, in fact, over time in sort of contradictory ways that ultimately do not help address the fundamentals of the issue. Thirdly, in building on what I've just noted, the book does a very good job of providing, I think, a readable assessment, integrated review of a subject matter that is often either found in highly specialized and obscure publications, narrow theme, thematical assessments. For example, money laundering would be one area of study, or are treated very superficially in somewhat journalistic and often sensational accounts of some events happening in the region. Fourth, the book's sort of integrated vision also makes it more in tune, I think, with being potentially policy relevant. This is not just a scholarly exercise, but this is an effort to try to address the issue in a way that it will attract attention and draw some conclusions relevant for addressing these problems for policymakers. The notion that drugs, crime, terrorism, and cyber threats can be sort of parceled out in distinct policy domains by different countries in different ways, by different institutions through different funding mechanisms, obviously is not particularly effective, considering that crime and violence continues to be on the rise throughout the region. And finally, the scholar in me also finds it appealing that the book is sourced abundantly. I mean, some books overdo the footnotes, but this is useful footnoting, if you will, and sourcing. With a diverse set of academic studies, formal government and multilateral institutional reporting, NGO networking sources, as well as some solid media sources as well. So this is seriously anchored, if you will, in reality, as well as what the works of others have already done in this arena. And let me conclude by maybe highlighting a question that is likely to be of particular interest, I think, to this program's audience today. And Ivelaw actually referenced it in passing in his PowerPoint presentation. That is the arms trafficking aspect of this issue. And to quote the book directly, the concern and consternation, end of quote, about U.S. sourcing of the weapons that fuel the violence and crime throughout the region. And one can see the deadly scope of this issue right now ongoing in Haiti itself, where gangs and criminal networks are extremely well sourced, a lot of it openly from the United States, and basically outgun what is left of the Haitian National Police. So this is not an abstract sort of academic issue. This is a real question. It involves sort of contradiction in the U.S. policy universe, and I think in some ways blind spots on a part of U.S. policymakers that are probably hard to overcome, since they involve a multiple set of political and cultural and constitutional questions. Clearly, a complete stop of weapons trafficking, for example, to Haiti is not going to resolve Haiti's security and political crises, but it sort of leads me to a sort of a final observation that is familiar to Ivelaw and others who cover this theme, namely that the United States appears more concerned about border security and what may be coming into the country, but shows little policy and political appetite for controlling what actually leaves the country, such as guns. So I hope, therefore, that maybe in the follow-on discussion, if we have time, there's an opportunity for Ivelaw maybe to expand a little bit on this issue and its sort of dangerous trajectory throughout the region. Anyway, I think it's a very timely, very readable book, highly recommended. Congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
All righty. I guess the torch is passed to me. First of all, I'd like to thank Carl, Robert, Global Americans, as well as the Caribbean Policy Consortium, in particular, David Lewis, for sponsoring this event. I'm not going to reiterate a lot of what has been said already, but I will say that this book could not be more timely for events which are occurring in the Caribbean. And I think George put his finger on it when he said that the development of events in the Caribbean today are chilling. And Ivelaw has definitely caught that and really run with it. And it's a wonderful book, well worth reading. I'm going to focus more very briefly on the issue of criminality and sovereignty and security, in particular with what has gone on in Jamaica with the Dudas affair, Dudas Coke. In particular, it's just worthwhile to give a little bit of background to it. Charles Dudas rose up through criminal organization. His father ran it. He operated out of Tivoli Gardens in Kingston. He basically created what's known as a garrison state. It's a mini state within the state. So if you're looking to challenges of sovereignty, that's certainly one part of it. And ultimately, he challenged the premise that the state had a monopoly on force. The whole thing comes to a head when when Dudas is convicted in New York on conspiracy of drug and guns trafficking. As Ivelaw mentioned earlier, there is a extradition treaty between the United States and Jamaica, and the U.S. requested that he be extradited. This incurred a considerable amount of political risk for the Jamaican government because tackling the gangs is always a difficult prospect, and the government dragged its feet. And eventually, after considerable pressure, both externally and internally, the Jamaican government went after Dudas. There was a considerable amount of fighting between security forces and the gangs, and ultimately Dudas surrendered himself. He was extradited, and I believe he's serving time here in the U.S. penitentiary system. I would say that there are, say, four things that come out of this, and this is with an eye to the rise of violent crime in the Caribbean, and in particular, what's going on in Haiti. First is causation, economic inequalities, and structural problems. And to quote from Ivelaw, poor communities often cope with relative economic and social deprivation by being complicit or turning a blind eye to actions by criminal gangs or individuals that provide economic and social goods not offered by state power holders. This is important because it brings up a certain amount of loyalty from the inhabitants in that community. And for all his criminality, Dudas was well liked. People were loyal to him in his part of the community because he provided basic services the government did not. The second factor, this situation is made worse by disrespect, acts of immunity, and corruption by people in security and criminal justice agencies. It goes to the root of the governance question, as well as how do we deal with corruption as a society. The third point is dealing with states within a state is a costly affair. I believe 11% of Jamaica's population got embroiled in it. It certainly hurt economic growth, and it really put a damper on tourism, which is one of the main generators of revenues in Jamaica. It was a very tough blow to the Jamaican economy. And it also had a traumatic dimension in terms of Jamaican society. The fourth point is to tackle these issues by governments, there's a need for political will. I think Ivelaw brings that out very, very well in a number of cases, like with Trinidad and Tobago, but even in some dimension with Suriname. But there also may be the need for external support, and that is also another aspect which is suggested. There's so much more that I could say. I do have my eye on the clock here, but I'd like to leave a question for our esteemed colleague here, and that is, where do we go from here? Is there a tipping point on violent crime, criminality, and challenge sovereignty within the Caribbean?
Thank you, Scott. Perhaps we'll give Ivelaw a chance to respond, and then if we have time, we'll address one of the questions that was put in the chat. But Ivelaw, do you want to respond to both comments?
Well, I want to begin by thanking both Scott and George for their thoughtful reflections on the book, and to say that we'll need another hour for me to respond to at least one of the questions. So I'll give a brief comment. The arms trafficking conundrum is one of those complexity conundrums that, especially since the source of the major flow of arms is the United States, the complexity of the American own domestic political jurisdictional issues. Now, and it's no consolation to say that this is the last few years have not been the first few years where American arms flowing into the Caribbean, complicating lives and livelihoods in the region. You might remember the 1990 coup in Trinidad. Where were the weapons bought? Right in Florida, at a gun show. So when you look at the domestic political realities of the United States, you begin to see, is there light at the end of the tunnel? Because the domestic political realities complicate the desire to do something on the part of the federal government. And so I think it's got to be, how can we massage and manage? How can we massage and manage, including massaging and managing using the economic levers? I am delighted to see that the lawsuit by Mexico is moving forward. I'm delighted to see that Caribbean jurisdictions have joined as amicus curiae in those lawsuits. And I'm hoping the day will soon arrive where Caribbean countries by themselves will bring pressure using the legal architecture of the United States to make a contribution to the domestic realities. Because as the case quite clearly shows in the Mexican case, you've got to get the people who are the manufacturers and the distributors to feel the crunch and to take some responsibility for helping to manage this clear and present danger. This is a saga. I can write 2 more books that will only touch the tip of the iceberg. I had an interview with Time magazine about 3 decades ago. Tammy Drummond was the journalist. I was at FIU at the time. Tammy called me very worried because she had gone through the Caribbean, focuses on drugs, and she said, Ivelaw, I left the region with a sense of fatalism, that the challenges are so great that the police chiefs, they don't know what to do. It's only practicing the science of muddling through. I think we're seeing an element of that fatalism in parts of the Caribbean, but I think we're also seeing bursts of hopefulness and hope. And I end the book with a poem that was not written in recent times, but it was written way back in 1919, and sending the message, my intent in that poem is to say, look, I think the poem by Claude McKay, If We Must Die, we gotta not die simply by turning down and being dead. There's gotta be resistance, struggle. And I think I'm hoping that we're not at a tipping point to see the collapse of the sovereign jurisdictions. We're not at a tipping point to see more Haitis, but there's a combination of fatalism and hope in the region. I'll stop there.
We're right coming up to the hour, so we have a few minutes, just about 2 minutes to answer this question, one of these questions that has appeared on the chat. I think I'm going to use speaker's prerogative. One of the overarching themes here is really state capacity. And if you look at, for example, at Haiti, all the cases really, but it's Haiti's the most extreme example, the most recent example. You have, I think it was Scott who mentioned the fact that, that poverty allows for or gangs take up the role of providing services and security and other things that the states can't when you have low state capacity. But also when you have low state capacity, it's very difficult to provide those services. So you get this kind of vicious circle. The state can't deal with the gangs, and the gangs do the things that the state cannot do. I think that's basically, in a way, the overarching theme of many of the cases that are here. And I think that also points to this worry that you have that we might have more Hades in the future, given the circumstances that you described. Just a very quick question that's almost a technical question that someone asked, which is that, Ivelaw, you mentioned that there are that challenge sovereignty is defined as the sum of 3 conditions. But then when we identify the problems, essentially there are 4 conditions, which is crime, drugs, terrorism, and cyber. I wonder, that's just almost a methodological question. I wonder if you can address that.
Well, it's a methodological question for sure, because you can have a basket of issues that is more than 4 in the basket to look at what are the contributors to challenge sovereignty. The conditions present what are the wraparounds for this challenge sovereignty concept. But you can have challenge sovereignty that looks at 2 issues, or 4 issues, or 5 issues. So in many respects, a number of problems without passports are separate and different than what are the conditions of challenge sovereignty. But let me also say that you're quite right that the challenge sovereignty issue and the problems without passports that manifest the challenge sovereignty have to do with not only state capacity, but state capacity in the context of the capacity of non-state actors, some of which rival the state actors. I remember spending a few nights aboard a U.S. Coast Guard sort of observing drug interdiction in the Grenada Basin way back. And I remember asking the captain, Captain Zukunf, what is the greatest pleasure you get from arresting the drug guys? He said, Professor, and there's none. Because this was a 240-foot medium endurance cutter. Some of the go-fast boats were running rings around the cutters. So it's not only state capacity, it's what is the greater capacity of some of the non-state actors, the drug guys, the gang guys. The state is not able to match their capacity. So surely capacity is an issue. But let me end on a note of saying what, and I said it's in the book, Haiti represents the most dramatic manifestation of challenge sovereignty. But Haiti, and I plan to write another study looking at another element of challenge sovereignty. Haiti is a manifestation of what the challenge sovereignty of the region's architecture. CARICOM, the inability of CARICOM by itself or even with others to make some appreciable inroads in helping the circumstance of Haiti reflects challenge sovereignty of the regional architecture called CARICOM. So there are many dimensions to this, but in the context of the book, Haiti is the most clear and present manifestation. It's like challenge sovereignty on steroids.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's clear that there's so much more, we said at the beginning or just before we went online that we could probably spend 4 hours talking about this. There are so many issues. We had a really good turnout. This will be posted on our website, I believe, so it'll be available for more people to see in the future. Thank you, Ivelaw, for your work, for your contribution, and for today. And thank you also to Scott and George for your comments, and especially to our Global Americans team who have been working behind the scenes to make this happen. So thank you for joining us. We will see you again.
Thank you all. A wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.